Okay, ready for part 2, where we have a look at sharpness and bokeh. Sorry, I'll stop saying that. Right, first up, I set this up to photograph this tiled wall. It's lit with the ambient light in the room, which are just some overhead spotlights that are in the kitchen. And it's on a tripod, mirror lockup, cable release as well, so I wasn't going to run into any issues of camera shake as I start to stop down the lenses, because obviously I'd have to make an adjustment to my shutter speed for the exposure reciprocals to maintain the exposure. I didn't want to crank my ISO up too high because that can have an effect on the sharpness of an image, so I kept it at ISO 100. Again, these were shot with the 500D with these two 50mm lenses. So first up, I'll go straight to the comparisons. We'll do the 51.8 wide open and the 51.4 wide open. Now we're looking at the raw files, so there's no sharpening been done on these, and we're not looking at the JPEGs. There is one image that I've made an adjustment on here that you can see for the 1.4, because it's a bit of a third. It was like a third of a stop off, and I wanted to see whether that exposure difference was making a difference on the perceived sharpness of it, and it turned out it wasn't, but we'll get to that a bit later on. So we'll compare these two here. Okay, so you have the 1.8 and the 1.4. So the 1.8 on the left, 1.4 on the right. Now, some of these previews will take a while to load, so this part 2 video is going to run a little long. So my apologies for that, we'll have to wait for some of the previews to render. Okay, so if we zoom in, this is the center sharpness, okay, on both of these lenses. Those previews have loaded, and we can see the 1.8 is sharper wide open than the 1.4. It's well documented, so that's fine. Now if we have a look at one of the edges here, edge sharpness, the 1.4 lens definitely, hands down, has the advantage over the 1.8. It's sharper at the edges. Okay, now what's most important to you? Depends on yourself really, what you photograph. So now we'll go to the 51.8 and the 51.4 at 1.8 and do a comparison. Like I say, these previews may take a little while to load, so there we go. I'm just going to give that a second. I think they have both kind of snapped in and they're loaded. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, if looking here, then they're very similar. The 1.8 might be fractionally sharper, or the 1.4. It's kind of hard to tell really. Again, edge sharpness, the 1.4 is definitely sharper than the 1.8. Okay, center sharpness, they are real close. You know, there's not a whole lot in that, to be honest with you. The 1.4, okay, no, I'll give the 1.4 maybe fractionally sharper than the 1.8 is wide open. So come off compare. Okay, and we'll go to f2.8 now. There we go, that's f2.8 on both lenses. Now as you drop down your lens, it gets sharper. Edges get sharper, center gets sharper as well. Any lens you buy will have a sweet spot, be that f4, 5.6, f8, whatever you find that it is. That said, you don't always have to shoot at 5.6, at f8. You know, you have creative options here. So looking at the center sharpness on these two lenses, I'll probably say the 1.8 looks a little sharper than the 1.4 does in the center, to be fair. Again, not a huge difference, but a little bit sharper. Edge-wise, the 1.4 definitely has the edge in terms of the performance at the edges. So, pretty close. The 1.8 wins there at about 2.8. Now, one thing to note is, as we go further down the aperture range, so f4, 5.6, f8, whatever, we're getting more depth of field. So, it's going to be harder to tell which is sharper as the depth of field grows. Okay, but they're going to look fairly equal. As we hit apertures of f11, that's probably the limit I would want to shoot either of these at. f16 and f22 are soft, it kind of sucks. So, come out there, go back to the grid view, we'll go for f4, And is this one the F4 one? Nope, that's the F2.8. That's the F4 one. And we'll compare those. Now I think I've switched the sides here. We have the 1.4, yes, the 1.4 on the left here, and the 1.8 on the right. That's because of the order I selected the images in. My bad. Okay, so they've both rendered in now. Pretty sure. Come on. Maybe this one hasn't yet. Let's come back out. They're definitely both rendered in now. Okay, and we can see, yeah, I think the 1.8 is a little bit sharper. Not massively so, but it's a bit sharper. So I'm going to come out and compare here. Let's see, that's the 1.4 version. Okay, that's 100%. I'm just going to make sure it's not taking longer to render it in terms of the full preview. Okay, so the 1.8's definitely got the edge, I would believe, on the sharpness there at f4. Now if we go to f5.6 for the 1.8 and f5.6 for the 1.4, again, edges are going to sharpen up real nice. Both of these, so the 1.8 left, 1.4 right, there's a slight difference in the brightness of the image, which I'm not going to bother going in and fixing. Okay, and yeah, they're pretty damn close really. The 1.8 there and 1.4 on the right. It could split hairs really at which is the sharpest there. And there's a little bit more of a difference at f4. Maybe it's a weak spot in terms of the 1.4 lens in that aperture. Sharpness again, I would probably give to the 1.4. Okay, so we'll come out of the compare and we'll go to f8. F8 and be there. Good old f8 aperture. Okay, lenses tend to perform pretty well around this aperture, so we're expecting, you know, pretty good results really from both these lenses. And you've got the 1.8 on the left, 1.4 on the right, and they're really close. So I would probably say at the 2.8 f4 range, the 1.8 has the advantage. As you go to 5, 6, f8, and we're going beyond, it's not a whole lot in it really. Edge sharpness, the 1.4 has the advantage. Oops, I'm a bit off the edge there. Over the 1.8. Okay, but that said, at this aperture, this stop down, the 1.8 isn't bad on the edges at all. It depends on what's more important to you really. I don't really worry too much about edge sharpness, like I've said before. It's just not something that I really worry about or think about. So go back to the grid view, and where are we? We'll go for f11. Now f11, middle of the road aperture. It's an aperture that I will use. It's probably as far as I would go with the majority of my lenses because I shoot on a crop sensor camera. You have what's called a diffraction limiting aperture, and for the format of crop, that tends to be, or for a crop format sensor, that tends to be around f7.1 ish, maybe 6.3, maybe f8, thereabouts. It will depend on your camera and the sensor, I imagine. That's where it's probably going to be the best, so around that middle road. As you stop down, the image is going to get softer because of diffraction, because the light has got to come through a smaller aperture, and then it kind of disperses out and bounces around a little bit, causing a little bit of softness. Okay, 35mm full frame, you have a bit more leeway. You're probably going to be able to hit f10, f11 before you reach that diffraction limiting aperture. A little bit geeky stuff. Generally I don't really worry about it too much, but I've looked at images at f11, looked at images at f16 and f22 with the majority of my lenses, and f16 and f22 are horrible. I will try and avoid them unless the situation I am in dictates I have to shoot at those apertures, then I will use them. You know, you make compromises. Photography is all compromise. So let's have a look at 11 with these two, and we've got the, oh, where's the compare gone? I think I hit the button twice. We have the 50 1.8 on the left, and the 1.4. No, we don't. I'm comparing the same image, or two wrong images. Yep, two wrong images. Bear with me. My bad. Do you even know how to use Lightroom? Apparently not. So the 1.8 at f11 and the 1.4 at f11. We'll select those two, compare. So with the 1.4 now, just to confuse you, on the left, and the 1.8 on the right. So for the 1.4 on the left, we'll zoom in on that one. The previews have rendered. You saw it kind of snap sharp there. Wow, yeah, there's nothing in that really. They're both very, very, very close. If we have a look at the edge sharpness, then the 1.4 may still have a slight edge, but it's really, really hard to tell when with this stop down on both the lenses. So, you know, it's like, there's definitely not a chalk and cheese, apple and oranges comparison here. They're very, very, very similar. Slight difference in colour, but again, that's a non-issue. So, near the wide open side of things, the 1.8 seems to be a little bit better. Certainly around 2.8 f4. Once you get around the 5.6 mark, or after 5.6, which the 1.8 is great at, by the way, the difference is really nothing. So f8, f11 are really, really similar here. So we'll come to compare. We'll have a look at the last two, which is f16, 1.8, and f16 for the 1.4. Now you may notice a slight shift in the exposure between the two lenses. That can happen, lens to lens, slightly different exposure. It usually happens more so if you go from a wide to a telephoto, but it could also be a slight fluctuation that was being used. A lot of thumbnail. We'll have a quick look at what we've got. So these previews of render. Now this is f16. This is going beyond really where I really want to be with either on the cameras that I shoot with. Oh, that's still loading by the looks of it. There you go. Okay, and there's not a massive amount of difference. As you can see, the image is starting to soften up in comparison to what we had when we were shooting at f4, 5.6, f8, middle of the road. Again, because of diffraction, images will start to look softer as you go fully stop down. Lenses have their sweet spots. So, edge sharpness, is it really worth looking at f16? Probably not. No, it's not. Not a massive difference. The 1.4 might still show the edge, you know, there, but you know, we're at f16, so everything's in focus, absolutely. Plus we're on one focal plane. There we go. So we'll have a look at the last, which is f22. f22 really, really sucks. f22, and look at these two. Like I say, bear with us on the loading. I know it's a little slow. I do need a new computer, I know. Wait for those to snap to sharp-ish, and we'll zoom in. So looking at the center, okay, 1:1. And the reason why we're seeing a slight shift in the position on the images is because as I've changed lenses on the camera's not moved position. It's just that on the tripod plate it does kind of sometimes settle forward or settle back a little bit. It's not enough to make to cause an issue on these tests. Certainly not when we stop down. Now the 1.8 does look a little bit worse here than the 1.4 does. So the 1.4 is holding better at f22 than the 1.8. It seems softer on the left hand side 1.8 than the 1.4 does. Okay, it looks kind of mushy, hazy. I mean, I have shot at f22 with the 1.8 before now, because I have to. It's not great, but the conditions that were there said, look, you need to shoot at f22 here. You have no choice. And that's when I'm using off-camera lighting, by the way. So, we have a look at the edge sharpness. Look at this compared to what we had at the likes of f11 and f8 on the edges. Definitely, in fact, I'll do a comparison between f8 and f22 in a moment. Yeah, that looks horrible. F22 sucks, worst aperture ever. Not amazing. So what we'll do, we'll go for F22 on the 1.4, because this is the lens we're considering buying, so we'll stick with this one, and we'll compare that to, where are we, F1.8, no I don't think so, F11, let's go for F8. Okay, so we have both the same lens here, the 51, and we have the shot here on the left at F22, shot here on the right is F8. Okay, the exposure is the same, the exposure reciprocals adjusted for that, you know, no change in colour, nothing like that. So what we'll do now is we'll zoom in, and remember F22 left, F8 on the right. F8 is a lot better, it's a lot more detail, a lot sharper. Okay, and if we go to the edges, we can really see that. I mean, that looks mushy, hazy, whereas we can see the separation and the detail better at F8. So stopping down your lens, you know, really stopping down your lens because you're worried you might not get something in focus, isn't always the best answer. F8 is a good amount of depth of field. You know, I mean, shooting with a crop sensor camera, if I'm shooting full length and I want a good solid depth of field from subject to the background, F8 in studio is going to get me there. F11 most certainly. I don't need to go any further and reduce image quality. So that's just a quick comparison for you. What we'll go to next is looking at the bokeh, sorry, of these two lenses. Okay, and what we have first is the f1.8 here at f1.8 and the f1.4 at f1.4. So let's have a quick look at these two. And we're in, and not a massive difference. Some may say the 1.4 is a little bit more pleasing on the bokeh. Maybe so, can't really see much of a difference. I mean, we're wide open here, so we've got a really shallow depth of field, so we're not going to see the aperture blades or the shapes of them becoming a problem in the bokeh if that's something that you're bothered about. So we'll go to a more stopped down image. Where are we? Let's go to 2.8. So 8 on the 1.8 there. And where are we? 2.8 on the 1.4. And we'll do a comparison. Hello? Have I got the right images? Yes, I have. So the 0.8 on the left, 1.4 on the right, and we'll zoom in. Now we can start to see a difference in the bokeh. We can see more squared off edges on the 1.8 lens. This is because the aperture blades, there's only 5 of them, so you create more of a hexagonal, or whatever you call it, out of focus highlights on that lens in comparison to the 1.4, which has more aperture blades. I think it's got 7 or something, I can't remember, but it does have more aperture blades, so the out of focus highlights tend to be a more pleasing circle. Now, whether you're bothered about that, that's up to you. Personally, not fussed. And your clients, if you're shooting for people, aren't going to look at an image and go, oh, I love it, wait a minute, that's a hexagon-like shape, oh no, I don't like it, I'm not buying it. No, they're just not going to see it. So how important it is subjective, depends on, you know, what preferences are. I've never been displeased with the bokeh or the out of focus areas, even out of focus highlights on the 51.8 lens. So let's have we'll go all the way now to, let's just jump to f8. Okay, so we're going to be able to see now those aperture blades, shapes in the focus, out of focus highlights more so at an aperture like f8. So we'll do a comparison of these two, and we've got the 1.8 on the left and the 1.4 on the right. Now let's give those images a chance to render, and there we go. So the 1.8 on the left, 1.4 on the right. Now definitely you can see a difference here, more circular for the 1.4, more hexagonal squared off for the 1.8. Okay, again, what you prefer, that's up to you. Personally, well, image, I'm not the shape of the bokeh in the background. Same as I'm not looking at an image that's been shot with a high ISO and looking for the grain. You know, you're looking at the image as a whole. We don't view things at 100%. So looking at these traits, these image quality traits, now I've not tested lens flare directly. I mean, it's been thundering and lightning here today, so there's no sun. I could do it with an artificial light, but I'm not going to. The 1.8 is prone to flare, but sometimes in a cool way. And looking at the image quality over the two for sharpness, the 1.8 wins, I think, at wide open up to f4. Then f5.6, can start to really equalize f8 and f11. They're really equal. As you saw, f16, f22 is not great on either. Edge sharpness across the board, f1.4 lens wins out. Shooting into a light source, so like what we saw with the mannequin head, the f1.4 wins. Definitely, hands down. If you're trying to go to technically the best lens is the f1.4. Build quality, the f1.4 is better. Out of focus highlights, the f1.4, yes. More circular, okay, you could argue that's better if you're that fussed about it. For me, I think what I'm going to do is, because there's not a huge difference other than when you're shooting into a light source, I'm going to stick with the 1.8 version for a bit longer. I will probably update at some point, but it's not a priority for just the sake of shooting into white backgrounds when I know I can fix it in post-production, and I know if I'm careful with how bright I take the background when I'm lighting white seamless, you know, I can kind of have some control with the 1.8, so it's fine. I can work with it. I'll be better spending that 3 times price difference on something else, you know, putting it towards another lens, like replacing the kit lens, the 18-55 for example. I'm probably going to get more money's worth out of that than I would going for the 1.4 50mm. If my 1.8 breaks, gives up, I drop it, and it breaks into a million pieces, which I expect will happen, then yes, I'll probably get the 1.4 when I replace it, if I had the money to and I can afford to at the time. Now, other considerations for the 1.4 which may push you towards that, if you're shooting nothing but studio lit white backgrounds, you might want to go for the 1.4, unless you like that flare, lack of contrast in the 1.8. Maybe you want both, who knows. If you're shooting in situations where you want quiet response from your camera and the lens, so the autofocus confirmation beeps turned off, this could be maybe weddings, christenings or other events, then the 1.4 is probably the best lens for you because it's nice and quiet with its USM motor, whereas the 51.8 sounds like it wants to kill itself whenever it autofocuses. The autofocus on the 1.8, I've said before now, can be a little bit aggressive sometimes if your camera or lens combination starts to hunt when in low light, and that can cause sometimes a misfocus. So the 1.4 may fare a little bit better. I'd have to do more testing really in low light, but this lens is going to go back. So there may be certain situations, certain ways that you shoot where the 1.4 is the one to go for. For me, if you've already got the 1.8 lens, I mean, I love shooting against white seamless and white backgrounds. I don't get to do it as often as I would like to, so I'm in no rush. It's not a priority for me to change the lens because of that. At the moment, I'd rather spend the money elsewhere. I'm going to keep the 1.8 for a while and then change it possibly at a later date. So hopefully this has been a good comparison and useful for you. What I will do with the JPEG images, I'll put them up in a set on Flickr if you want to go and have a look at those and compare them side by side yourselves. Hopefully this video has given you a good insight onto the sharpness, because I've recorded it full resolution screencast. Bear in mind YouTube obviously will compress this somewhat, so we'll see what we get there. Any comments and questions, stick them in the comments below. Drop me an email, and don't forget to check out newtophoto.com and the YouTube channel for Newtophoto as well as the meetup we've got arranged for Newtophoto coming up on the 16th of September also. I'll stick the information in the description for you. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I know it's been a bit of a long video, thanks to this slow PC, but I will catch you in the next one.